Brazil's approach to foreign policy and what that could look like under potential Lula administration, specifically vis-a-vis the United States. And then we can have, if there's time, since I'm so late, some questions and discussion. So hopefully that's not redundant with whatever you guys discussed. All right, great, okay. And I do have notes, so excuse me, but at the end of the day, I have to refer to notes or else I'll forget. So I think everyone knows, right? This is really a race between two presidents, one former president and one incumbent, being Lula and Bolsonaro. There are two other candidates in the race, Ciro Gomes and Senator Simone Tebet, that represent, I think, more centrist forces, but frankly, they lag so much behind the polls. They're not really a viable factor in this election. So with less than 3 weeks to go before the first round on October 2nd, President Bolsonaro is clearly trailing by double digits Lula right now. There was an EPEC poll, it's the old Ibope poll for those of you that used to follow, came out I think the day before yesterday, showing Lula with 46%, Bolsonaro is 31, and in a second round, October 30th, Lula with 53 to Bolsonaro is 36. Another Datafolha poll had Lula around 45, Bolsonaro is 34, and again Lula clearing the victor in a runoff. So, I should say, despite these polls showing wide margins, there has been some narrowing of the gap in other polling. BPG had a poll that was significantly smaller, showing a gap of about six or 7 percentage points to Lula and Bolsonaro. And I think to the extent we have seen some narrowing in polling, it could be because the economy is picking up a little bit. I think some of the benefits of Brasil is being felt by some of the consumer base, and some of the initiatives the government has taken to curb inflation, right? The fuel, the tax cuts, support public transportation, other things have helped a little bit to improve a little bit the economy. And frankly, we've also seen some undecided voters start to take a position too. And I think as we get closer to the election, you'll see that both candidates are going to be proposing more social spending, right? Because to boost their candidacies. And since the main issue of the campaign is the economy and it is social vulnerabilities, I think some spending proposals will be forthcoming. They already are, really, and they tend to have, of course, broad voter appeal for obvious reasons. So why is Lula so far ahead? And I think it lies in what voters are most concerned about. It's the economy, it's inflation, it's high food prices, it's energy prices, it's unemployment. I mean, hunger is back, and there's a real sense of food insecurity in Brazil for the first time in a long time. Social issues, housing, education, the quality of public services is the second bucket right there underneath that. Healthcare, especially in the context of, barely out of this pandemic. And interestingly, and this is a notable shift from 2018, but corruption is a little lower down in the scale. And I think it's not that it's not important, it's just the other issues have taken such precedence over the past few years. And I think of the two candidates, Lula is clearly stronger on the issue that voters care about, especially lower income voters that remember how times were during his first mandate, and the millions that sort of are able to enter the middle class with a lot of the welfare policies that were enacted under his government. And they view him with that sort of, through that lens of that nostalgia and trying to recover some of those lost gains. And interestingly, this is a mere reflection of what happened in the US in 2020, where Trump was weak on the main issue, which was COVID-19, and he lost the election as a result. So to regain momentum and very much cognizant of this, Bolsonaro has, thank you, I have to get a little bit of water, but I may go to that soon. Bolsonaro has sought to address some of these concerns, right? By augmenting the Oecd Brasil, was able to do a constitutional amendment to expand social spending, which during an election year is actually not typically allowed because of concerns about buying. And the spending package that did pass, it not only expanded the cash transfer program, but offered free public transportation for the elderly and fuel subsidies and a host of other factors. So I think many voters, though, have interpreted those spending moves by Bolsonaro as sort of electorally friendly in an election year. I think it's actually undermined a little bit the president's case. So I think that perception, coupled with corruption scandals, coupled with COVID-19, has just really, I think, put the president on a back foot in this campaign. And I don't think he's going to be able to make that up in the next 3 weeks. So though Lula is favored to win, he definitely won't avoid a runoff on October the 30th. And of course, avoiding a runoff would involve a candidate getting over 50% in the first round, which I think won't happen according to any of the polling scenarios we've seen. And that's not unusual, right? I think Brazil's had a runoff election for every presidential campaign since the return to democracy, with the exception of Fernando Henrique, who was the first Democratic elected president since the return. So it's a normal thing. So runoffs are not unique, but what does make this election unique is, I think, the extreme polarization, in the sense that this election is about a battle for Brazil's soul. And it's really more about, who has the stronger rejection, right? Is it the anti-Bolsonaristas or the anti-Petistas? And so it's almost an election about rejection, I think, than it is necessarily about endorsement of one of the two main candidates. And in general, this sentiment, this sort of rejection is not unique in Brazil, right? We're seeing it all over Latin America. I mentioned I work with Chile, I work with Argentina. I'm part of a broader team at my firm that is Latin America. And Ipsos came out with a really interesting piece of market research firm. They came out with an interesting opinion poll a few months ago, indicating that the top 4 countries where voters or the electorate had the highest distrust in government was Colombia, Peru, Chile, and Brazil. So there's overall a sentiment that the political elite, economic elite, just don't care anymore about the middle class. And we have a frustrated middle class that doesn't feel heard, that feel like the gains they have made have largely been eroded. And this can, I think, partly explain why a third of the electorate in Brazil believes that there could be fraud in the electoral system, why they're questioning for the first time ever the integrity of Brazil's election process, despite there being no evidence to support that there could be fraud. So I do believe that even though this sentiment isn't widely shared in Brazil, it does heighten the risk in this election of there being a contested election and a possible rejection of the outcome, should Lula, as expected, win. And I think this distrust has also contributed in Brazil and in other countries too, to a basic howling out of the political center. So that is why candidates like Ciro Gomes and Simone Tebet I don't think they have as much of an audience right now because of this extreme polarization, because of this feeling like the soul of the country is at stake. And because, frankly, Lula and Bolsonaro have huge name recognition that would be almost impossible for anyone else to really, I think, sort of take an edge over. So, that is a little bit, I think, where we are with that. So I think this brings us to the next topic, which something I've been talking a lot to my clients about, which is democracy at risk in Brazil? We've heard a lot of rhetoric. There's a real concern about some of that rhetoric, the risk of violence, a lot of concern about the role of misinformation and fake news, and the possibility of a January 6th scenario arising in Brazil, and or a tumultuous transition of power. And I think many observers, myself included, we expect a lot of noise, possibly violence. In fact, I think violence sadly has already started. But I don't think democracy itself in Brazil is at risk. And I think despite the attacks and the rhetoric that we've heard, Brazil's institutions have really demonstrated a very high level of resiliency throughout the past 4 years, with other branches checking the president when necessary. And not just the other branches of the government. We've seen business leaders, civil society, pushing back strongly against his statements about the elections and statements against the Supreme Court and the judicial branch. Last year, over 260 business leaders and civil society members published an open letter affirming their faith in the electoral system and Brazil's commitment to democracy. We saw another letter very recently as well from members of the business community. So I think if Bolsonaro, in the event, he's made some more pacifying statements in recent days. He gave an interview a day or two ago saying that, if he didn't win, he would just probably retire from politics. But, if he were to refuse to leave office, I think support for him, even among business or centrist parties that have supported him in the past, honestly, I think would be very, very low. Not to mention civil society, public prosecutors, the Federal Police Association, et cetera. I think that premise could be tested in the weeks and months ahead, but I do think Brazil will ultimately weather this political storm, and whoever wins on October 30th will be universally, accepted and recognized, and I think sworn into office on January 1. And if this all sounds a little optimistic, to quote your point, Sydney, we have to be optimistic if we work on Brazil, right? Compelling, not even. But we are looking at possibly a difficult transition for the beginning of a new government. And so, all this said, as I mentioned, to release of many last week was Brazil's commemoration of its 200th bicentennial of its independence from Portugal. There's a lot of concern about it, but the events, the demonstrations, the parades, the flyovers were largely peaceful. The president's remarks were more moderate than they were last year. And so, there's some cautious optimism that maybe the process will go as everyone hopes and expects that it will. But it's clear that I think there are still tensions ongoing between the executive and other branches of Congress, of other branches of government, excuse me. I think notably both the House and Senate leadership were not in Brasilia for the commemoration of the bicentennial, which is a marked departure from protocol. Now there was a Supreme Court justice. So anyway, I think just points to some continued tensions there between the branches of government, which we'll expect to see, I think, for the next, at least through the end of the year. And the wild card in all this, of course, is the armed forces, especially if the president, were not to concede. It's not clear to me, frankly, and maybe you have a different view or my dad, but it's not clear to me where they really stand, because there are some active generals, that do support Bolsonaro. His vice presidential candidate is a general, but at the same time, there are others that sort of, leave us out of politics. We work for the state, we don't work for political parties. So I do know, and this does give me a lot of confidence, the Supreme Electoral Court, the TSC, has taken a very proactive and aggressive role in trying to not control the narrative, but trying to control for misinformation, to shut down efforts to tweak it all or change the electoral process, including denying some requests from the armed forces. So I think that the work that they've done, as well, I should say, reaching accords with various online platforms, try to control and try to take down user accounts or videos that are clearly false, I think is helping a lot to mitigate the risk that misinformation could really be a contributing factor in this election. But anyway, what are the main challenges for a new government, or the next government, I should say? And I think whoever wins, frankly, whoever is sworn in on January 1, it's going to be a challenging environment. There's the ongoing continued challenges of inflation, of supply chain disruptions, of the food, the escalating food crisis, the fuel prices, and of course we also have global, conditions that are going to be continuing to put some pressure on Brazil. And I don't think it's going to change obviously before January. And I also think that Brazil's recovery and how quick that is from this very contentious period will also function as a short-term challenge for the next government, because, the next, should Lula win, as we expect, he's going to be facing a good percentage of the electorate that don't believe he's legitimate and that reject him as their president. So I think he'll have some challenges there from the outset. So what could the priorities be for a potential Lula administration? Certainly, I think we will see some advances in reaffirming Brazil's commitment to democracy and integrity of institutions. I think there's going to be a big focus on climate and regaining Brazil's, leadership role in environmental protection and on climate action. I think we're going to also see an increased focus on extending labor rights and labor protections, especially relevant, I should say, in the context of the growth of the app industry through the COVID-19 pandemic. I think we'll see an effort to reform the tax code, which has been the holy grail of every single administration of every political party that assumes the presidency in Brazil, to make it slightly less regressive. It's a highly regressive tax system that is primarily consumption-based, which of course impacts the poor the hardest. I think we'll see a larger role for the state with respect to not just social programs, but Brazil's state-owned enterprises. I think any efforts to privatize Petrobras will be completely off the table. I think Lula could also look to roll back the Eletrobras privatization. The BNDES issue is a question. I just don't see, I think the fiscal environment in Brazil will limit the scope of Lula's ambitions on a number of those fronts, including, I think, the role for BNDES in supporting Brazil's traditional domestic champions. I just don't see Lula, if he's going to be able to govern, is going to have to build bridges in general, and not just with centrist parties, but with investors. And they do keep a close eye on Brazil's fiscal account. So I think there'll be some natural checks and balances that will have to occur in terms of the role for the state, at least in the early part of this presidency, in terms of economic development. I think the infrastructure concessions programs, which actually have been going through many administrations, will continue. And here I'm talking about the concessions for operating the rails and the roads and the ports and the airports. There's a widespread consensus, I think, that the private sector is going to have to help Brazil deliver on a lot of that. And so I expect that to continue. I think there'll be a big focus on promoting digital transformation and digital inclusion, and a continued focus on promoting financial inclusion and the role of the exponential growth of the fintech industry in Brazil to try to promote, democratize access to financial services. That's been a big accomplishment, I have to say, of Roberto Campos Neto, who was the president of Brazil Central Bank. We've seen, I think, 600% growth in the fintech industry in Brazil, and that's enabled a lot of people to get access to much more competitive, lending rates, mortgage rates. My brother, who lives in Brazil, he's been with his wife for 15 years. I think last year they've got their first mortgage, and they're both tenured professors. So stories like that, I think, will continue. And I think I see the Lula government continue to promote a lot of that. I was at a meeting yesterday with the OECD. I was in Washington, but they were on Zoom. They're talking about Brazil's accession pipeline for the OECD, which has been a big priority of the Bolsonaro administration. Brazil, of course, was one of 6 countries invited to join the accession pipeline early this year to the OECD. And it's been a big focus of the administration. And Minister Guedes, I don't see Lula making Brazil's OECD accession a first or a second or even a third priority. I just don't think, I think his focus will be not so much on aligning Brazil's, policies on tax and investment to OECD standards, but he's going to focus a lot more on sort of shoring up those concerns on food and on hunger and on inflation, et cetera. All this said, I think Lula's choice of Geraldo Alckmin, the former governor of São Paulo, as his running mate, is meant to appeal to business and to investors that do care about things like the OECD and to centrists. And I think it signals that a Lula 2.0, actually, I guess Lula 3.0 technically, is going to be pragmatic, right, and open to dialogue. And I think, I work a lot with business, so this is often the lens that I view things in, but I don't think they're expecting to like everything they hear or everything that comes out, but there's an expectation that at least we'll have a conversation. And in this case, I think Lula likely will distinguish himself from his successor, Dilma Rousseff, who I think had a much more heavy hand and a much more rigid approach to policymaking, which in the end, I think undermined her success during her tenure as president. So all this, of course, depends on Lula's governability, right? And what this looks like. Let's not forget the elections this October is not just about the presidency, it's about the entire lower house, it's about a third of the Senate, it's about 27 governors. And so I think his governability is going to depend on 3 main factors. One, of course, is going to be to what extent the transition process is contentious, to what extent Bolsonaro does continue to sort of stir controversy and undermine legitimacy of Lula's win and sort of the new start to his government. 2, I think whether Lula does in fact pursue the common sense policies that he's indicating he will. And that policy that can gain kind of broad cross-party support. And 3rd will be the party composition in Congress. The legislature will still include a substantial number of lawmakers that are in the opposition. And Lula will need to really shore up support from the center to be able to advance on any of his priorities. So he has shown himself to be able to do that, but he's an older Lula, right? And this is a different Congress, and this is a different time. It's a much more polarized environment. So to what ability he'll be able to kind of navigate and to reach the new audience that he has will be an open question. So that's, I think, on the election and on sort of what to expect from the Lula presidency. And maybe I'll turn a little bit to foreign policy now. And specifically sort of focus on the U.S.-Brazil relationship and a new government. And I'll talk a little bit about what that would look like for Lula and as well for Bolsonaro, because, for Lula, I think I certainly see I see more synergies between the Biden administration's agenda and a potential Lula administration. I think cooperation on climate and energy are pretty obvious. And on energy, I should say, that's already actually quite happening between U.S. Department of Energy and Brazil's Ministry of Energy. But cooperation on climate and energy and human rights and democratic governance, not just in Brazil, but in the region, And we can expect close coordination. On the OECD accession, like I mentioned, I don't see a lot of coordination on that. I don't see Lula placing that as an immediate priority. And to be frank, the US also has mixed views on OECD expansion. So actually was surprised that 6 countries were invited to a seat. So I don't see that being a prominent feature of the agenda the way it is now. And same for trade, right? Lula, the Workers' Party, traditionally has championed more protectionist policies and trade policies that favor a domestically led economic development strategy, which I think will limit any sort of cooperation with the US on exploration of a trade agreement. Of course, there's also Mercosur to think about. And frankly, the Biden administration has also shown no interest in pursuing a robust trade agenda. I mean, trade is basically a 4-letter word now in DC. So I don't see, and with the midterms coming up in the United States in November too, I just don't see trade at all factoring on the agenda. It won't be, there won't be friction. It just sort of won't, I think this won't be a lot of dialogue. Ironically, a Lula administration would be better positioned to advance on a pending EU Mercosur trade deal, which was, of course, finalized in negotiations in the early part of Bolsonaro's administration. But it's been pending, and there's been European opposition to advancing on that, given Bolsonaro's stance on the environment. And really, frankly, of course, the agricultural market access has been very controversial as well with European farmers. Lula has said he would insist on a renegotiation of that accord, which I don't see the Europeans doing. So I think trade in general, globally, not just in Brazil, is a little bit on the back burner, as many countries are doing with more domestic concerns. I think overall, Lula understands the importance of a close relationship with the US. But traditionally, and I think this would still be the case in the Lula 3.0, traditionally, his geopolitical instinct has always been to balance that approximation with a counter to Europe and, of course, with China, right? Which Brazil relies heavily on for trade, to the factor of 3 times the United States, which is the next most important trade partner after China. So I would expect more of the same. And I think, interestingly enough, Lula, again, if he's elected, he'll be inheriting as well Latin America that has decidedly shifted, a little bit more left, with AMLO in Mexico, with Petro in Colombia, with Boric in Chile, with Fernandez in Argentina. So I could see a scenario where regional cooperation is a little bit higher on the agenda because there's frankly space for political dialogue. And of course, we know that in general, South-South cooperation was always a priority. And I think if Latin American integration does strengthen, perhaps with the leadership of Lula and others, Boric maybe helping to congeal some of that, it could have a beneficial impact in terms of putting Latin America on the radar into Washington. And again, I live in Washington, and so I see a lot of things through that lens. But Latin America historically has never figured very high in DC, apart from migration issues in Central America and kind of Venezuela, Cuba, which are really more domestic issues in this country, really are not necessarily regional specific. So I think that could perhaps help push up a little bit where Latin America is, and force, I think, Biden administration. I mean, but I can't even blame Biden. This has been true of many administrations, to focus a bit more on the region and kind of what's occurring there. And I think if Bolsonaro is reelected, actually, I was with the Brazilian ambassador this morning at a breakfast with some companies, and I actually posed this question to him, kind of what to expect on the social agenda and the economic agenda. And I think, his answer, I didn't surprise me, a little bit more of the same on some of the reforms, but he put a big emphasis on social spending, right? Which is no surprise. And so I think, though, when it comes to the US and Brazil relationship, I think we will continue to see it continuing very strong, sort of at an institutional level, but it'll never be overly affectionate at sort of the executive presidential level, which I think always limits a little bit the space for cooperation. And I think beyond that, if Bolsonaro is reelected, I think tensions will continue to the US and Brazil on the environment, kind of governance, on human rights, et cetera, which are all pretty much core priorities of the Biden administration, which will limit, I think, the relationship to mostly kind of low-hanging economic issues that will be ongoing. So anyway, I've said a lot. I apologize for if I spoke for too long, but there's a lot to talk about. So I'll leave it there.
Absolutely. No, thanks so much, Gabriel. And one of the reasons why we bring Gabriel every year here, it is because of the feedback that we get from students. And now you know why. Right? How she can summarize like all the chaos, and we're just, one of the things that we're talking about is that your ability to tell the narrative and bring some order to the chaos that we see in Brazil. Gabriel, I think it's great that we are focusing on the elections and short-term kind of Brazil is facing, and how what we might expect from a potential Lula administration, right? Since we have another 20 minutes, why don't we talk a little bit about from the long run perspective, right? Then one of the things that we like to see in Brazil is that in Brazil, we don't miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And I think it's shocking the fact that Brazil just celebrated the 200th anniversary of its independence, and we didn't see the opportunity to talk about Brazil in a more in a different perspective, right? So the focus so much, and I think the media is also the one to blame about the use of the date for political purposes instead of eliciting a reflection about the country, right? So how can we reconcile these short-term challenges with all the potential that we see in the country?
Right. Well, I think I'll answer from the perspective that I view it, which of course is working with companies. And companies that I work with have been in Brazil for like 80, 90, 100 years. They have weathered, they're not afraid of political cycles. They've been weathered some economic cycles, but it comes back to the economy. And I don't know if my dad shared a little bit of the economic outlook in Brazil, but if you look at Brazil, benchmark against the region, it's not just look too bad. We started the year with 0.2% GDP forecast. I think we're going to end closer to 3%. So that's hugely positive. Unemployment is ticking down. You still have this enormous consumer base of like 212 million people, which is always attractive, for investors. The situation is tight, but Brazil's reserves are very high, so I think its ability to weather external shocks is much better. And when you look at Mexico, when you look at Argentina, when you look at all the uncertainty in Chile, Brazil looks like not a bad bet. So I think this is one of the reasons why, and I should make one other point too. There's been a massive rebound in FDI in Latin America as a region, with Brazil being some of the leaders. I actually looked on the numbers somewhere. Of course, I can't find it now. Oh, I found it. In 2020, of course, there was a huge dip, right? So these numbers reflect the fact that there was enormous contraction in 2020. But in 2021, FDI in the region rebounded by over 56%, with Brazil getting 78% of that money. And I think it's because over the long run, Brazil, it's not that it misses an opportunity, but it's just too compelling to ignore. And so we see that. I mentioned the fintech industry, and the growth has been tremendous, and it is an issue too where I think leadership matters. And so I think investors see a huge opportunity in Brazil, not just in fintech, but in renewable energy, where Brazil has always been a dominant leader. There's been a huge influx of money going into solar and into wind. I could name many other industries. So it's in all this, despite all the trade barriers, despite a lot of bureaucracy, despite the going from left to the right. At the end of the day, Brazil is a compelling story. And so I think in the long run, that's why we are always optimistic about Brazil. And we kind of have to weather a little bit these political cycles and different views of economic development and how to approach it. Because there is a feeling that at least you can have a conversation in Brazil, and you can have a dialogue, and the government is accessible. I may not always agree, but I think, I think the promise is there, and that's sort of the joke, right? It's the country of the future and always will be. But to a certain extent, there's also certain truth in these old idioms. And especially as I look against the region, I think Brazil for the long term is a pretty good bet. Of course, I work with the country, so I kind of spell it for a living, but I do believe it. So I don't know if that's really answers your question.
Absolutely. So let's hear from the students. Any questions for Gabriel? Yeah, Justin, and then let's hear from people who haven't spoken yet.
So, oozing with potential, Latin American countries, such as Brazil, fail to utilize and invest back into the labor force, resulting in like stagnant production and growth and fewer skilled workers. To counter this economic plateau, should Brazil, like Mexico's adoption of NAFTA, lessen their protectionist policies and embrace a more open and foreign connected economy?
Well, there's the rub. And this is really an economic theory question, right? Brazil's commitment to Mercosur, which has remained steadfast. It was actually discussed this morning at the breakfast that I mentioned for the ambassador. And I see, especially with the Lula return, that framework is going to stay in place. And frankly, part of the reason is why that Brazil, it's migrated from a customs union to something a little bit politicized. And I think that has held the country back, to be totally frank with you. I work a lot with the high-tech industry, ICT industry, and that industry has been enormously frustrated with Brazil because of the high tariffs to do with the common external tariff. And that has impacted Brazil's ability to really insert itself in global supply chains. So we can have the argument, the argument about trade and whether does trade really, really result in meaningful, wage growth and in jobs. And this is the debate the United States is having right now. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Biden administration has been completely sort of hands tied on trade, afraid of a slaughter during midterms, because a lot of those jobs have gone away. You could say it's automation, you could say it's trade, but trade has sort of been the boogeyman. So I personally think, and people have other views, I do think that Brazil's tethering itself to the Mercosur framework, or at least not considering a flexibilization of that framework, starting with a reduction, I think, in the common external tariff, does limit its ability to insert itself in supply chains in a way that could contribute to some meaningful productivity gains and maybe even retraining of that labor force. But I don't see that changing as well over the next 4 years. There were one thing that the Bolsonaro government did do was make some marginal reductions in those tariffs, but not really meaningful enough to really impact it. And to be honest, the pushback against domestic industry in Brazil is always enormous, and it's always a political headwind that every administration, has to face. And I will note too, it's not just domestic Brazilian industries, but U.S. companies that established there 100 years ago that have taken advantage of some of the complexities around Brazil's tax code and local content requirements to benefit from that. So they also don't have an interest in seeing a lot of those trade barriers go down. But I do think at the end of the day, it is limiting. And I think that the whole world, not just Brazil, needs to rethink, I think, the argument around trade. Because there is an issue, right, with people being left behind, people losing jobs, and I'm not sure that some of it was trade, not all of it, but trade isn't going to also solve that problem. So we do need to have a conversation around workforce retraining, preparing people for the skills of the 21st century, and digital inclusion is a big part of that. One thing I'll say for Brazil, and I heard this statistic this morning, so I can't say I thought it on my own, but if you look on the rank of countries that have digitized government services, Brazil ranks globally number 7, which is huge because Japan is 21. So I think the trend, I think we're going to see an exponential increase in digital transformation over the next few years in Brazil that hopefully will also be able to bring some small SMEs and entrepreneurs, especially with the group of the app economy, I think into the formal economy, but also into just participating. So those are my thoughts. Took too long to answer.
So Bolsonaro, forgive me for pronouncing his name wrong, is portrayed as somewhat of a terrible and extremist leader in the Western media that did not bring any good to the country. It was mentioned earlier that the state of the Brazilian economy is not where it should be, and there are clearly countless other problems facing the country. You mentioned that the polls are looking better for Lula, but that Bolsonaro is still going to get around 30 to 40% of the vote in the first round and make the second round. What is it that Bolsonaro has that appeals to millions of Brazilians? Are they voting against Lula's alleged corruption that has been disproven, or for Bolsonaro's policies?
Yes, it's a good question. So it's a confluence of factors, and kind of like Trump, he's got a base of supporters that are going to support him no matter what. When he was first elected in 2018, it was on a anti-corruption, law and order, public security platform, because those are the dominant issues, especially with the Lava Jato, scandals, and a lot of the antipathy towards the PT coming out of that. I think if the people that continue to support him, yes, there's a certain sense of rejection. It's anti-PT, but I think it's also because of his portrayal of himself, especially the evangelicals, as like a family values kind of guy, right? And he's appointed, similar to Trump, a number of judges that are evangelicals. The evangelical caucus in Congress has really solidified. And I think that has driven his policy agenda to a large extent. He's actually held back a number of projects on legalization of casinos and gaming, for example, because of the evangelicals. His position on guns too, has been very popular, not with women so much, but with men. And so that I think is another core factor of his constituency that are more like the single issue voters. He's got a bunch of single issue voters and he hits them hard on every one. He's also very popular with the bancada rural, the agribusiness community. And I think a lot of it has to do with leadership of Teresa Cristina, who was the former Minister of Agriculture, who did do a lot to promote Brazilian agricultural exports abroad and to facilitate the growth of that industry and to invest technology in agricultural productivity. So that I think also all those factors, it's the family values, the anti-PT, the guns, the evangelical caucus, it has comprised a little bit that 30% that will support him no matter what. Maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah, and then,
Thank you so much. My question, you already touched base a little bit between about the US and Brazil relation now, but I want to know a little bit more. What is the interference? Is it due to historical reasons, and why it feels like there is something that doesn't really allow the US to relate more connected with Brazil?
It's a good question. And it's one we've been scratching our heads for a long time, but at the end of the day, it's really relationship looking for a meaningful agenda. United States, not when I say Washington, I mean Washington. There's just too many distractions, right? With wars in the Middle East, with now, Russia, Ukraine, I mean, you name it. Brazil also has had a long-standing policy of non-interventionism when it comes to foreign policy, which means they have not automatically sided with the U.S. when they want to invade Iraq or do whatever the United States is doing. So that's also, I think, influenced the U.S. ability to see Brazil as a geopolitical strategic partner, on some global issues. But it has to do with the confluence of those things. It's distraction, it's other priorities. It's a little bit, the position of Brazil, which is, I should say, is independent of party in Brazil, this policy of non-interventionism, limiting, their ability to maybe go along with the U.S. on Security Council resolutions, that kind of thing. So it's been that. And I will also say on the Brazilian side, there is, I think, with Itamaraty, Brazil's foreign, affairs ministry, there's a legacy there of sort of lingering historical distrust about U.S. interest in the region, I think stemming from the middle of last century. And so that's, I think, also limited and over eagerness even on the Brazilian side to look for ways, to cooperate. But all that, and as a result, I think in Washington, including in this White House, but not unique to this White House, there's just a lack of expertise on Brazil. There's not people that speak Portuguese that really know the country. Now the U.S. has been without an ambassador for a year and a half. We'll probably be another year and a half without an ambassador. That's not unique to Brazil, by the way. About a third of posts in Latin America are currently without a U.S. ambassador. So that also, I think, limits the ability of Washington to really engage without having sort of a champion for the relationship that represents the United States in Brasilia. So it's sort of a little bit of everything.
I had a question regarding politicians and in general. So I was reading about how in the last couple of years, a lot of first-timers and fresh talent have actually entered the political arena in Brazil. So I think in 2018, that was one of the highest number of, first-timer politicians entering or being elected. Do you think that's made much of a difference, at least in the last couple of years, if that's in any way contributed to solving?
It's helping, but it needs to happen more and faster, and not just in Brazil, right? In Chile, actually, we just saw election of Boric, who's 36 years old, the youngest president in Chile's history. After decades of Bachelet Pineda, we're finally getting some new blood in here, and there's been some missteps, but I think politics in Latin America in general is desperate for innovation, of political leadership. And so we are seeing some inroads. We saw with Tabata Amaral, who was, to Congress a number of years ago, but there is still, it's hard, and it's hard to break into politics in Brazil because of the way that campaign financing is structured, and TV and airtime, media time. And so it's a difficult system if you're young and unknown and don't come from a political dynasty, if you will, to break into. So it's made some changes, but it needs to happen at a much more accelerated pace for us to really see, I think, that translate into policy and translate into changing the public discourse a little bit. And that's, I think, part of the voter frustration and the distrust with the political system that I was mentioning that was in this Ipsos poll that I thought was really interesting. And it's really a disenchantment with the political establishment that you know, they haven't done anything for the people. And I think a regeneration of the political leadership would really help a lot with some of that to regain that faith in politics. But it's starting, but it's a kind of a trickle. So it needs to happen faster.
And Gabriel, we always devote 15 minutes towards the end of our sessions to talk about professional development.
Yes.
And this is a professional class for most of the students here who end up following your footsteps and Tom's footsteps, right? And I think what the two of you share in common in your professional career is the fact that you work in the public sector, you work in the private sector, and you work in the nonprofit. So what the two of you can share with the students as they pursue careers similar to yours and they see you as role models in the future?
You know, it's sometimes the easiest questions are actually the hardest, because if you ask me, now I graduated from SEPA in 1999. If you asked me when I graduated, what would I be doing or the road I would have taken, I would never have told you what I ended up doing. So I think the first thing I'm going to say is kind of get out of your own way. Don't assume you know what's best for you. And if an opportunity looks interesting, you can also make it your own in your own unique ways. And the job market is always a bit challenging. I think certainly for this class it will be as well. So don't try to presuppose too much the outcome. You know, sometimes, and myself included, I thought, oh, I have to graduate and I have to do immediately, you know, career in national affairs, and I didn't, because I didn't get a job right away in that field. But when you look back over the arc of the career, you thought, gosh, I'm glad I did work in the United States Senate for a couple of years, and I'm glad I took that job at that industry association, so I really know what companies care about and how they use associations to advocate for their policies. And boy, I'm glad I took that executive branch job, because now I understand a little bit how decisions are made. And, you know, so you kind of weave your quilt as you go. And don't think because you don't get your dream job coming out of SEPA that, you know, you're off the wrong foot, because you never really know, you know, what a job could lead to, who you could meet. And think about the job as not just for that job, but the next job, and who you could meet that would help you with the next job and the job after that. Because life is a sequence, right? And you don't always see all the chapters the very first day after you graduate. So I would say that, and frankly, gosh, you know, I'm dating myself, but I don't think they even had LinkedIn when I graduated. So you guys also have a lot more resources at your disposal, and I get, you know, LinkedIn messages all the time from SEPA students or from my undergraduate. And use those networks too, because we're always happy to meet people for coffee. And I've actually hired SEPA students to be my intern. So, you know, don't be shy to apply. Yeah, I don't know if that was very articulate, but it was a little bit my thoughts. I don't know if I want to share anything.
I got you to use LinkedIn.
I think you did get me out of LinkedIn. I got more connections than you have.
Oh, it's just, it's very true. I mean, it's a matter of investing in your educations, taking advantage of opportunities, not valuing so much the first job as the experience you get, looking to work with good people. A good boss is very important, rather than the prestige of the organization. Know what you want to do, but be open to change. Jump at opportunities if you can, wisely, but try to do it. And by all means, stay involved in international affairs. That's what I would say. I mean, like Gabriele, I trained to be an academic, and was convinced that my future was in academia, teaching, or work at the World Bank or something in the not-for-profit sector, which I think many of you can relate to. And those opportunities weren't there when I graduated. I wondered if I was the least likely person in the world to work on Wall Street. I wound up working on Wall Street and actually survived there for quite a few years. But then I had this experience, and I look back on it, so I'm glad I had those experiences, because compared to people who always run the not-for-profit sector, they understand a little bit more about how the world works or the mentality of the private sector. So I would by all means, continue interest in international affairs, but be broad-minded. Don't waste so much the first salary and think about what Gabrielle is saying. You know, you don't want to be hopping from one opportunity to the next, to the next, to the next. That's not good. But be open to change. Don't give up. I think the world needs the kind of profession that it's not going to seem this way to you late at night when the term papers are over and the job interviews aren't coming your way. But the world needs people who have. I'm talking as if everybody's a super graduate. Maybe not everybody is, but I think you can relate to what I'm saying, and that you can have a good career. And I would say too, Gabrielle, if you agree with me or not, you can't money. To be successful in international affairs and in public policy, money can't be the driver. But on the other hand, you don't have to starve to death either. Want to do?
Right, that's right.
I agree with Gabrielle. It's kind of hard to give advice, but I wouldn't change a lot of what happened with Gabrielle. In saying I should have done it another way, or shouldn't have left that job, or
Yeah.
sorry I did what I did. And we're involved in important things, but we're talking about here in Brazil, that affects the lives of many people, and you have to look at it that way. Businesses have to be well advised, and governments have to make the right sorts of decisions, and social policy is important, and someone needs to understand it. The world of good intentions, it's not enough to bring about the types of changes that I think, and I suspect many of you think are necessary. You need skills, you need talent, you need to study those economics, take all those economics courses, even though you might not be drawn to them.
And by the way, what the students should be doing right now that will help them access those opportunities?
I mean, internships are important,
I think so too.
really important. So, and I worked every semester at SIVA and summers in between. And those are very important. And like I've actually I ended up hiring some of my interns, when I occasionally have an opening. So internships are important, and it's not necessarily for where you work, but again, you're going to expose yourself to a professional world, and you're going to be doing the events or sitting in a meeting or, taking notes at a conference and sitting next to somebody. So it's important for the networking aspect too, I think. So I would highly value internships, and in DC where I am, there's lots of NGOs that put on events, and I think in New York it's the same, right? But there's tons of events all the time. They're mostly on Zoom. They're starting to migrate now in person, but showing up to those things and sort of talking to who else is in the room. Companies are there. Future employers are all sitting in those rooms. It's harder on Zoom, so I have a lot of sympathy for the past 2 years. But take advantage of those events too. And like reach out on LinkedIn, reach out to me or to other folks,
And something that had a huge impact on my life is language acquisition. You amaze. I opened you up to new cultures. That's what they're talking about. That's very interesting. But you also stand out in the world for knowing another culture. And in my case, I certainly married a Brazilian, I have to say. But I think if I had sat and thought objectively without any emotions involved, with the country that I studied, that people are really interested in, today that might be China. It might be, it would certainly be Brazil, and you don't want to learn the languages and cultures, and that's something that's always going to be in short supply, especially in our country. Especially if you're thinking of working, the Americans in the room, or those who are thinking of working in the United States, there's so much to occupy us, right? Got really distracted us domestically that we forget about the rest of the world. But the rest of the world is important and determines our future, and we don't have enough citizens in this country or around the world who really do understand and take the time to know it well.
That's right.
And explain it.
It's not just the language, but living and working abroad is hugely beneficial for career in international affairs.
I think so.
I mean, my firm, for example, like unless you've worked and how they operate in Buenos Aires or in Beijing, like they're not really of interest. They want people that know, that understand, right? That can come to the table. Hey, I've lived in Beijing, I lived in Singapore. Let me tell you, this is how the Ministry of whatever decides this. So getting that experience, knowing the culture, I think also give you kind of a fingertip sense for not just politics and business, but just the public mood. And I think that is what companies or firms like mine, those are the kind of employees they want to attract.
All right, so in the top of the hour, I want to thank Gabriel and Tom. Thank you so much. Like
Sorry,
very
I was
insightful.
late.
Yeah, sure thing. It was a great way to kick off the semester, the academic year, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks.
Good luck to all of you. Thank you. Okay.